And welcome to another edition of Global Perspectives. I'm your host, Atish Baidya. We are talking with two people from South Africa reflecting on the life and legacy of Nelson Mandela. With me is Nkosi, Gugu Nkosi. She is from South Africa. Also, Jillian Berkowitz from South Africa as well. Gugu was a student here at Ohio University, and now she is a counselor in Columbus. And Jillian is the director of the Ohio University Press here at Ohio University. Thank you both for joining me today. Let's jump right into it. Earlier this week, there was the big celebration of Nelson Mandela's life in South Africa. He's being buried in his ancestral home on Sunday, I believe.
Right.
Your reaction to the news and your reflections on his legacy.
Well, firstly, I would say when we had the breaking news, I was in South Africa. That was last week, and it came as a shock. Although, of course, we knew that Mandela was quite very ill for quite some time. But, of course, it was a shock. It was like we are not expecting it to happen now. And, of course, the first thing that just came to mind when I heard that was, I wonder where South Africa is heading to now that he's gone. You know, he's done a lot for all South Africans, regardless of color, regardless of religion, regardless of, you know, all the differences that we see in the world. He just brought the whole nation together. So being a unifying factor for me as a South African, I just felt, I hope the way he has tried to unify us, it will remain like that. And growing up in South Africa as a young person and seeing him for the first time when he was released in 1990, and I went there to see him, I mean, that was like a dream come true. You know, it was more like something that would never ever happen, but it did. And the legacy that he actually leaves with us as South Africans, I think it's very deep and it's challenging for each one of us, you know, in that it is time. Of course, we cannot forget the past, but to go on with the future and build this beautiful rainbow nation that he unified us when he came from prison after spending 27 years.
Jillian, your thoughts, reflections?
I agree with Gugu in that even though it was, of course, anticipated and he had been ill and people hadn't seen him for some time, I think that South Africans and the whole world dreaded this moment. And when it came, it was shocking, but in many ways, I think that the international response confirmed his phenomenal legacy. For me, he represented zero cynicism. And it was so remarkable that he never seemed to put a foot wrong. He was groomed in many ways in terms of his earliest years as in the Eastern Cape, but even so, he seemed, people sought him out, and he conferred a sense of idealism. He remained an idealist, even though I think we were speaking earlier. He was an important part of the armed struggle, but he was able to convey the importance and the justice even of the idea of violence in the name of justice and equality.
You know, it's interesting because we were talking earlier before we sat down here, and that, you know, the United States labeled him a terrorist when he was doing the armed struggle. And Dick Cheney has said in interviews that he doesn't regret the way he voted when he was a member of the House of Representatives, labeling him as a terrorist. And I'm fascinated by this idea of labeling of people by those authorities in power against others, and how it frames or can frame people's perspective on things, especially in the age post 9/11 with terrorism, and the way we use that word, and the media uses that word, and governments use that word nowadays to describe something that may not be, from their perspective it's one thing, but from another perspective it's something else. In broader terms, what do you think Mandela's legacy is in terms of sort of that dynamic of, here he was labeled a terrorist, and now he's this revered figure of peace and reconciliation and compassion and tolerance and all of these lessons of humanity striving to be the best that we can be?
Well, now, if I could just take you back to maybe the days of the armed struggle. You know, with apartheid, it was hard, and of course, for the ANC to adopt what today would be classified as terrorism, you know, that was the only language that the apartheid government could understand, you know. That is why they had to go even underground, so as to be, as part of the armed struggle. So in order to make a statement, I know today it can be terrorism, but however, we don't use that term terrorism in South Africa, you know. So I think because of the different situation and time, that is how, that was the only way in which, you know, they could make a statement so that the government understands what is it that people who were discriminated were wanting at that particular time. Because
the context is that they were striving for it without a violent component for so many years.
Right.
And
there was no change.
There was no change.
Absolutely. So now they had to change into adopting violence. It was violence, of course. Many people died, you know. But that was the only language, I guess, that the government could understand at that point in time.
And do you think in events around the world nowadays, when we're talking about oppression or are we talking about discrimination, that nonviolence as an attempt to rectify those things is not being used first and then violence as a last resort? Does it sort of shift automatically to violence? Or is it a much more, probably much more nuanced than that, obviously, but...
Right. It would not be really saying then if, you know, there are no resolutions or, when there are negotiations and then nothing happens, then people have to resort to violence. Not necessarily. But looking at the time, you know, apartheid was hard. It's even difficult for me to describe how it felt or how the situation was like. You know, it's difficult. But I'm not saying that I am perpetuating violence, but, you know, negotiating that's where we'd start, you know, and talk about those issues depending really on the situation. But then it was just different, you know, so I'm sure that is why even with the armed struggle, they had to adopt violence. As I've said to you, many people died, you know, both black and white, you know.
But it was a fight for freedom.
Absolutely, it was. Although it has left lots of scars, you know, in South African lives. I'm sure it has with you as well, Jill, you know, in a different way, you know. Violence, it can leave the biggest scar ever because it is some kind of trauma. You see that? And it depends how people react to that kind of trauma. You can react differently. Jill, of course, different from what I experienced, although she is a South African too, you know.
And that's an interesting point, that sometimes when we talk about apartheid or we talk about the end of apartheid and we talk about the system of discrimination and oppression, that we focus on those that are being oppressed and the impact and the trauma that can cause, the system can cause. But there's also folks who are on the other side, who are technically the oppressees, that still suffer trauma and pain. And their own sort of oppression in a way, because it's the system, it's not the people. Can you talk about what it was like for you growing up in apartheid? What that experience was like?
Sure. I was just, thinking also in terms of the movement in the South African context. The ANC started in 1912 as an absolute committed to a peaceful transition. Gandhi was a very important part of the development of that movement as well. But it's important to recognize that the acts of the South African government on the majority of the people of South Africa through the deprivation of a way of earning a living, migrant forced removals, taking away of education, these were acts of terror. These were ways of decimating a population and demoralizing. And the South African government was on a trajectory where they were then denying people the whole homeland policy, denied people even their citizenship. It was almost like a final solution set of initiatives that were unfolding. And so I think it's important to remember that as part of the decision to take very limited acts against government installations. There were also instances which would have been hard for the rest of the world to understand, where certain so-called acts of terror were perpetrated by the South African security police to undermine the ANC. So it was a real mess. It was a profoundly ugly, frightening situation. To answer your question, sorry, grew up in Cape Town. My father came from Latvia in 1935. Just was very fortunate to escape. He felt very indebted to the South African government for taking him in. Cape Town. My mom was born in Cape Town. They had a store. It's a beautiful city, but you could, as a white, because things were so separate, you could choose sort of not to be aware of what was going on. But once your eyes were opened, they were opened. Earlier I gave you the example that you would be on a bus, on a whites-only bus. It would be half empty, and you would sail past a bus stop where there were lines of people, say in the rain, waiting for their bus. Your bus wouldn't stop. And it was a sort of a kind of a consciousness raising when you suddenly noticed that and you felt implicated in this great injustice. Most of the black people that one ever met were either domestic servants or workers who had apartheid very effectively sealed people from each other. And I would say that my first opportunity to really interact with black people as equals came at university. I went to University of Cape Town, and there were certain departments that were certain areas, subjects that were not offered at the separate black universities, and that gave one the opportunity to interact. But even then, they went home at night to their places, and they had all of their transportation difficulties. So even then, it was hard to have real friendships, but luckily it was possible.
What was it like, that eye-opening experience for you, that awakening of your consciousness about what was going on? Was it something that happened just in university? Do you think as a child you got hints of it here and there that obviously you didn't know how to process until you have some perspective of experience and wisdom of age, or being older or a little bit more mature?
I did have one sort of experience which I've in about the second grade, there was a young classmate whose father was under house arrest. He was awaiting trial because his name was Fred Carnison, my classmate was Ruth, and he was awaiting trial because he was in fact part of a an attempt to bomb a station. It was, and we went there, and I was sort of a little surprised that we were going to visit Ruth's place, but we went, and when we came out, my father said to me, you know, he said, Jilka, in this country, you can go to jail for being good. And it sort of stuck with me. But I never questioned him about it. When I went to university, he said, oh, don't get involved in politics, you know, it's very dangerous. But he never, you know, and then years later at the press, we did a book called White Courts, Black Lawyers, or Black Lawyers, White Courts, actually. They were interviews with people who had become lawyers in the apartheid system, and I met Albie Sachs. And just told that to him, and he sort of had a sense of who it probably would have been who would have put my father in touch with Fred Carnison. And I'm not trying to claim anything, any big activism for my family at all. My father was probably chosen because he was sympathetic, but would never have been suspected of this. But there were such people in the struggle who played those sorts of parts. It was Ray Simon, I believe. She would have known exactly who to ask at this particular time in all this whole clandestine operation, this whole way of trying to effect change. Yeah, so there's little things like that, but I have to say, I can't say that there was much visible opposition in my world growing up.
What about in your world?
Well,
What was it like for you?
my world was completely different from, from Jill's world. You know, coming from Soweto, Orlando West, and Mandela's home with Winnie. I would pass there all the time when going to my elementary school as a little girl, and I would see, you know, police officers all the time, you know, patrolling that street. It's a popular street today, it's known as Vilagazi Street. But, you know, I didn't understand what was going on. Of course, there was that some kind of little hearing there and there, you know, because things that were about the ANC or what was going on, of course, you would not even have pamphlets and things like those. So, you know, but I knew that there was something going on, but I never get to understand. And then when I went to a high school, I think I went only up to it's called grade 7 here. And then, unfortunately, then with the 1976 student uprisings, then my family sent me to Swaziland, to a boarding school, to finish off my high school. So you see, for 4 years, so much was happening in Soweto that time. You know, there was no schooling for most kids, you know, lots of activism because most students were involved in lots of student protests, and they were just saying, we are not going to allow this oppressive government to sort of impose Afrikaans as a medium of instruction. That was the main thing, you know. So all those years I made it out, and then coming back to South Africa from time to time to visit my parents, it felt different because now I had 2 different worlds, you know. I was in Swaziland, it was completely different, and even the kind of education that, you know, I actually, the kind of education that was there was totally different from the South African one, because in South Africa it was already the Bantu education, you know, which was totally crafted for black people. You see that, and lots of just meant for black people. You see that. So I was learning something that was different. I was learning about the history of South Africa, about Mandela, about, you know, all that, which was not, you know, in South Africa at that time. So I was more like quite a lot exposed a little bit to some more, you know, more informative and very empowering kind of instruction, and that helped, let me say. But of course, there were there were lots of other South Africans who remained in the country, although some of the families that I know did send their children to schools, to Lesotho, to Botswana, and to Swaziland. And now those were sister countries then, because they were independent since they got their independence in the 60s. So it was more like going to school in an independent country where you would be free to learn anything. So that was more like a plus in having
Did you feel the difference? Did you feel that sense of freedom of when you were in school in Swaziland and coming home, and was it a sense of entering when you would come home into something more oppressive and stricter in sort of controls? Were you aware of those things?
A little aware of those things. For instance, with the separate amenities, you know, I'm aware, oh, okay, this is a park, but those benches are just for white people. I cannot go there. But when I was in Swaziland, it was different. You see that? Because there was no racial discrimination. I mean, they were in shops. I remember when I was with my mom in Piet Retief, I think the taxi had stopped there because we had traveled by taxi. And then there was a line for white people and a line for black people. And being a little girl, I thought my mom was going to be arrested.
Sure.
Because she demanded that she wanted to stand in this shorter line, of course, for white people. And she told the person at the cashier that she has the same money as the white person. So I was scared because I was away. And I thought something bad was going to happen to my mom. As a little girl, seeing her just protesting and telling this Afrikaner woman who owns the shop that I'm going to give you the same money that you will be getting from a white person. What's the difference? So, you know, we were aware, and I was aware as a little girl, and being afraid, you know, and living in Soweto, seeing the police patrolling our streets from time to time, you know, helicopters flying very low level, and you think, what is going on?
Huge lights.
Yes, huge lights, you know, and also coming at night at some houses, you know, banging doors and waking up people looking for whatever they were suspicious of. You see that? So it was hard. It was hard. So she grew up in a different environment, but still in South Africa, and I grew up in a total different experience. I mean,
were you afraid when you were a little girl and you were experiencing these things? Was it just fear, or at one point does that fear transform into critical questioning and then frustration and I want to say anger, but to the point where you realize that you need to do something, but you sort of get the sense of the injustice or of the discrimination.
Right, you do get that sense. And of course it does take you into anger, by the way, because you're thinking, why should I be living this way? You see that? But of course, parents would always say, remember, if you talk about these things, you will be arrested. You see that? So now it puts a lot of fear as you hear from other neighbors that so-and-so has been arrested, you know, so-and-so has disappeared. Lots of young people disappeared during that time. You see? And there was a lot of fear and terror, as she mentioned, that
I think that's
that
an
was
important
part
thing.
For you as well, fear and
Yes.
terror.
The interesting thing, it was perceived and felt differently, but it was a one characteristic of living in apartheid South Africa was this sense of fear of the government.
Right.
For some people, certainly for black people, a lot of there were police everywhere. Right. There were uniformed police everywhere. There were police with dogs. There were and it certainly was much more a fact of life if you were black and if you in any way tried to push the lines. But the sad part of it was that for whites who were in many ways insulated from the worst of these kinds of this police action, they interiorized this fear and it paralyzed them. It was a very, very effective system. People counseled their children not to get involved, to toe the line, not to take chances because they feared something quite amorphous. But you knew those penalties for living in an authoritarian, it's very hard to explain the ways in which people take on, they stop acting as citizens.
They sort of unplug themselves.
And
in
I
a way.
remember we spoke a lot about, especially at university and especially as one became part of a movement to want to see change, I think the biggest thing that often that white say students would speak about would be apathy. This great fear of all you would see was what seemed like this big giant frightened inertia. And which is kind of not exactly the same as fear, but it's in the same family.
So, regardless of your skin color, the government was instilling fear, different maybe types of fear or circumstances of fear, but fear across its population. Do you think, how do I phrase this question? Do you think that in the absence of this fear, that human beings can treat each other the way that the system was set up to treat South Africans, based on skin color discrimination, based on certain characteristics? Do you think that that is possible as a system, or it can only exist with fear from an authoritative figure across the board to all its citizens? Or do you think that without the absence of fear, that absence of fear across the board for all of the citizens, apartheid could not exist? Do we treat each other? Do we treat each other? Can we treat each other that way, or would the white population not be as apathetic, stand up for what quote unquote is right, and the system will not be the way it was?
People are people, and I think that although there are all these there are other issues other than race, their class, there are all kinds of stratifications. But make no mistake, in South Africa, the security police, and this grew and grew and grew to very serious proportions. If you did decide to oppose the government, you had to be prepared to go to jail, you had to be prepared to be tortured, you had to be prepared to have them mess with your family. You weren't imagining these things, which I'm not trying to in any way make excuses for the fact that this huge body of, why South Africans didn't take to the streets and march and show solidarity. But there's the South African Bureau of State Security, BOSS as it was called, was not a figment of people's imaginations. But in terms of your question, how would South Africa have developed if there hadn't been apartheid and this incredible number of repressive laws that just grew and grew? I mean, one of the posters that I always wish that I had taken was this thing, too many laws and too little justice. I imagine you can look at the United States and see the ways in which there would have been challenges based on race and class. But I think the situation in South Africa, because it was enshrined in law, was unique. What do you think?
That's interesting in that, the whole terror and fear, the government made sure that it even used black people. So that is why,
pass laws, for
yes,
example.
yes.
Yeah.
So that is why it was quite unique. Our own policemen would be the ones who would actually, kill or arrest their own people. You see, because they were working for the government. So I think really the whole apartheid system was crafted in the way that there is just a reign of terror. She was terrified in a different way, and I was in my own way because of where I grew up, because of the experiences and the whole environment and seeing it every day, So it was part of the whole recipe of making up or coming up with the whole system of, the oppressive kind of government that we experienced during apartheid. And most of the time, of course, people of color were the ones, of course, who suffered a lot. And of course, there were white people, as Jill has mentioned, who were involved or who were against the oppressive government. You see that? So I think the reign of terror was also part of it. Had it been not there, it's hard for me to even imagine
Right.
how it would have been.
And there was a sort of another big sort of lie at the center of it all, the whole notion of separate but equal.
Equal,
Well,
right,
they were
was-
separate, but it was not equal. I
it
mean,
was not.
It was, and I mean, people, the number, there was a thing called job reservations.
Right.
So, whereas, so a black policeman who would need to take a job to feed his family would be compromised in this way. So they pitted people against each other
Yes.
because there were just so few jobs.
Fear, divide and conquer,
Yes.
controlling the masses. I want to wrap up here. We could talk for a lot longer, and I wish we had the time, because I think this is absolutely fascinating. But in the context of the future, because you had spoken about this when we started the program, and you're concerned about the future of South Africa now that Mandela is not with us. What lessons does South Africa need to take with it from Mandela as it journeys forward, as it journeys forward, and then what lessons do you think we all can take from him, especially given the political climate here in the United States right now as well?
Right.
Loaded question,
Yes,
heavy
it is.
question.
It is loaded. It is loaded indeed. What we're taking from him, really, I think it's the whole legacy of seeing him, or him wanting to see equality across board, the respect of human rights. For me, I think that's what stands out the most, and with him, we've seen, I mean, he really went hard in making sure that human rights were respected. And I'm hoping that, I know we have a different kind of government right now, and we are struggling with lots of things. There's lots of corruption right now, which is very disturbing. And I hope South Africans will find a way to address those issues in as far as the new government and all these other things that are happening. But in any way, issues of human rights, that's what stands out for me. And he was actually the pioneer for that. And I think that's the biggest thing for me, because it covers all the different aspects in life when you talk about human rights. It's equality and making sure that people are actually, they enjoy even the fruits of liberation, but at the same time learn to be responsible, because when we talk about human rights, we also talk about responsibility. It is the right, but then what is your responsibility then in making sure that that human right, has meaning, and it's actually pushed forward and everyone benefits out of that. So I'm hoping that we've learned a lot from Mr. Mandela's legacy, and we will continue to do that, and hoping that there will be change in some way. I am hopeful, Of course, there are some other issues. He's a man, he's a human being, he had his flaws, but I think we've also learned from his flaws as well. So
That idea of responsibility. When you have a human right, what is your responsibility to push that forward? Do you agree with that, especially given that because you talk about the context of apathy and fear and in the white population during the apartheid, that if you believed in the fundamental human rights, that you would have the responsibility to fight for those who have been denied those rights, no matter perhaps what the cost is to you and your family, which that takes a lot of courage.
Right. I think, the type of courage that people have to show in New South Africa is very different, in that probably the biggest danger is that South Africa has become a one-party state for all intents and purposes, and the sort of wonderful, the ANC, which Nelson Mandela's legacy, he sort of embodies this legacy of the armed struggle, the fight for freedom, and a one-party state is not a viable way forward. And so people somehow, in terms of responsibility, have to find a way to authentically challenge the ANC. So that a vote towards that responsibility, that kind of critical response to the ANC, does not necessarily mean that they're traitors to the cause, that they're turncoats, that they're, and I think that is a hard, people need the language and they need all kinds of ways to develop a more diverse and a more workable party system in South Africa, and it'll be, people trusted Mandela and his belief in the principles of equality across the board, and there isn't quite that same feeling with the present leadership. There's just no getting away from it. But you know, we have him. He was a fighter. He was a saint. You can't ask that of too many people. But South Africa was incredibly fortunate to have that model, and he always will be that model.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I also want to say there's a book coming out, Jillian, 491 Days by Winnie Mandela. Where's the camera? There it is. So that's coming out in, when is that coming out?
February.
February. So you can read more about that through this book, which is based on her diary entries.
Yeah, during her detention, and there were also letters between her and Nelson Mandela when they were both imprisoned.
And then the press also has a series of short stories on the history of Africa. One is the ANC Youth League by Clive Glazer. The Idea of the ANC by Anthony Butler. And help me with this one.
Umkhonto weSizwe.
The Spear of the Nation.
By Janet Cherry.
Spear of the Nation.
Spear of the Nation. And then this is 491 Days by Winnie Mandela. Okay. So I got a reading list now that I've got to add to. Thank you both for coming, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Global Perspectives. We'll see you next time.